The lighthouse had stood for 93 years on the edge of the continent, where land gave up and ocean began. A white tower rising from black rock, beam sweeping through darkness every 15 seconds, warning ships, marking the boundary between safe passage and destruction. Thomas Garrett had kept that light burning for 40 years. He was 68 now, with hands weathered by salt and wind, eyes permanently squinted from watching horizons, and a silence in him that came from decades of solitude. He lived in the small keeper's quarters attached to the tower base, a 2-room space that smelled of coffee and kerosene, and the particular dampness that came from living beside the sea. Tomorrow, the lighthouse would go dark, permanently. The Coast Guard had installed automated systems. GPS made lighthouses obsolete. Progress, they called it. Thomas called it the end of something that mattered, but nobody asked his opinion. Tonight was his last shift, his final night of climbing the spiral stairs, checking the mechanism, watching the beam cut through darkness. After 40 years of this rhythm, climb, check, watch, descend, he would have nothing. Retirement in a town where he knew shopkeepers, but had no friends. A pension. Empty time stretching ahead like an ocean with no far shore. The storm was building. Thomas could feel it in his joints, smell it in the air, that electric charge that came before heavy weather. Wind was picking up, clouds moving in fast from the west. The kind of night when ships needed the light most. The kind of night the lighthouse was built for. He made coffee in the small kitchen, checked the weather radio, gale warnings, small craft advisory. He looked out the window at the darkening sky and thought, at least the last night would be a real one. A night that mattered. He climbed the tower at 7 o'clock, as he had for 14,000 nights. Checked the bulb, the rotating mechanism, the backup systems that wouldn't be needed after tonight. Everything working perfectly. The beam swept out across black water. 15 seconds of light, followed by 15 seconds of darkness. The rhythm that had governed his life for longer than most marriages lasted. At 8:30, someone knocked on the door. Thomas froze. Nobody came to the lighthouse. Nobody except Coast Guard inspectors, and they never came at night, never in approaching storms. He descended the stairs, boots echoing on metal, opened the heavy door against wind that was already strong enough to push. A man stood there, heavy build, dark jacket soaked with rain, hat pulled low, collar turned up. Hard to see his face in the darkness and weather. "Can I help you?" Thomas shouted over the wind. "I'm sorry to bother you," the man shouted back. Southern accent, tired voice. "I was driving along the coast, saw your light. Thought maybe I could wait out the storm here, just for a few hours." Thomas hesitated. He wasn't supposed to have visitors. But this was his last night, and rules didn't seem to matter much anymore. And there was something in the man's voice, a weariness that Thomas recognized. The sound of someone who needed shelter from more than just weather. "Come in," Thomas said. Inside, with the door closed against the wind, Thomas got his first good look at the visitor. Late 30s, maybe 40. Dark hair, sideburns, something familiar about his face that Thomas couldn't quite place. The man kept his collar up, his posture suggesting he was used to hiding. "Coffee?" Thomas offered. "Please." They sat at the small table in the keeper's quarters. The lighthouse beam swept overhead every 15 seconds, light bleeding through windows, creating a rhythm of illumination and shadow. "Last night," Thomas said, pouring coffee into chipped mugs, "after tomorrow, this place goes dark. 40 years I've kept this light burning. Tomorrow it becomes a museum, or gets torn down. Haven't decided which is worse." The visitor wrapped his hands around the mug. 40 years. That's a lifetime. It is. My lifetime, anyway. Never married. Never had kids. Just me and the light. Thomas paused. People think it's lonely. They're right. But it's also necessary. Ships need light. Need someone watching. That meant something. Meant? The visitor asked quietly. Past tense? GPS makes lighthouses obsolete. Nobody needs someone sitting in a tower watching anymore. Satellites do it better. Thomas sipped his coffee. Progress, I guess. But it feels like losing something. Like the world's deciding certain kinds of watching aren't worth doing anymore. The storm was building outside. Rain hammered the windows. Wind screamed around the tower. The visitor glanced up as the beam swept overhead again. Light, dark, light, dark. How often does it do that? He asked. Every 15 seconds, like a heartbeat. I've lived with that rhythm so long I don't notice it anymore. But tonight... Thomas trailed off. Tonight I'm noticing everything. Last time climbing those stairs. Last time checking the mechanism. Last time the light means anything. Maybe it'll mean something different, the visitor said. Maybe not warning ships, but marking something else. A memory. A testament that someone cared enough to watch. Thomas studied his visitor. You talk like someone who understands about being watched, about people needing something from you. The visitor smiled slightly. I might know something about that. They talked for hours. The storm raged outside, but inside the lighthouse, two men who'd never met found themselves sharing truths they rarely spoke aloud. Thomas talked about the ships he'd guided, the lives he'd maybe saved just by keeping the light burning, the nights he'd watched storms and prayed the beam would be enough, the strange intimacy of being needed by people who'd never know his name. I've seen wrecks, Thomas said quietly. Not many, but some. Before my time, mostly, but one during. A fishing boat, engine failed, got pushed onto the rocks south of here. Light couldn't save them. They were already too close. I called it in, watched the Coast Guard come, watched them pull 3 men from the water. 2 lived, 1 didn't. You blame yourself, the visitor said. Not a question. I know it wasn't my fault. Light was working perfectly. They just got too close before they realized. But I still think, what if I'd seen them earlier? What if I'd called sooner? Thomas shook his head. You can't save everyone. But when your job is to watch, every loss feels personal. The visitor was quiet for a moment. Then, I understand that. Being responsible for something. Knowing people need you. Knowing you'll fail some of them no matter how hard you try. What do you do? Thomas asked. For work. I perform. Music, mostly. Must be different from this. You're on stage, visible. I'm in a tower, invisible. I don't know, the visitor said slowly. Maybe it's not that different. You stand in one place and send out light, hoping it helps people you'll never meet. I stand in one place and send out sound, hoping it reaches people I'll never know. Both of us trying to guide strangers through darkness. Thomas looked at this man, this tired, thoughtful man who'd appeared out of a storm, and felt something shift. Recognition, maybe. Not of who he was, but of what he carried. The weight of being needed, the loneliness of being seen but not known. Do you like it? Thomas asked. Performing? Sometimes. When it connects. When I can feel that what I'm doing matters to someone. But other times... The visitor paused. Other times it feels like I'm just going through motions. Like I'm the light, but I've forgotten what I'm supposed to be illuminating. That's when you remember, Thomas said. Remember the first time it mattered. The first ship you saved. The first person you reached. Hold on to that. And when you can't remember anymore, then you trust. Trust that even if you can't see it, the light still matters. That someone, somewhere, needs what you're sending out. At midnight, Thomas climbed the tower to check the light. The visitor came with him, following the spiral stairs, boots echoing on metal. At the top, in the lamp room, they stood surrounded by glass and machinery, and the massive Fresnel lens that magnified and focused the beam. The storm was directly overhead now, rain sheeting across windows, wind howling, darkness absolute, except when the beam swept through it. Incredible, the visitor breathed, watching the mechanism rotate, the beam cutting through rain and darkness. How far does it reach? 22 miles on a clear night. Less in weather like this, but still far enough. Thomas checked the bulb, the gears, everything working perfectly one last time. This lens was made in France in 1889, shipped here when they built the Lighthouse. It's older than me, older than my father. It'll outlive me too, sitting in some museum probably, people looking at it like a curiosity. Or like a testament, the visitor said. Like proof that people once cared enough to build things that lasted, to watch over strangers, to send light into darkness not because they'd be thanked, but because it was right. They stood in silence, watching the beam sweep. 15 seconds light, 15 seconds dark. The rhythm Thomas had lived by for 40 years. Can I tell you something? The visitor said quietly. Something I don't usually tell people. Go ahead. I'm tired. Bone tired, soul tired. I wake up tired. I go to sleep tired. And I don't know how to stop. Don't know how to rest. Because if I stop, what happens to the people who need what I do? What happens to the light I'm supposed to be sending? Thomas understood that exhaustion, had felt it himself on countless nights, sick or injured or just worn down, but climbing these stairs anyway because the light had to burn, because stopping wasn't an option when people's lives depended on you. You know what keeps me going, Thomas said. Knowing that I did it, that for 40 years, this light never failed. Ships could count on it. Sailors could trust it. Even on my worst nights, even when I wanted to quit, the light kept burning. That matters. That's a life. Is it enough? The visitor asked. A life of just keeping the light on? It has to be. What else is there? We do what we're built to do. You make music. I keep light. We both try to guide people through darkness. That's not nothing. The visitor nodded slowly. Thank you for saying that, for understanding. They talked until the storm passed and the first grey light of dawn began to soften the eastern sky. Thomas made more coffee. The visitor sat at the window, watching the ocean go from black to grey to something almost blue. I should go, the visitor said finally. Let you finish your last shift in peace. You didn't interrupt anything, Thomas said. You made it better. Last night alone would have been hard. This way, I got to remember why it mattered. Got to share it with someone who understood. The visitor stood, extended his hand. Thomas shook it, firm grip, calloused hands, the hands of someone who worked. Thank you for the shelter, the visitor said, and the conversation, and for 40 years of keeping the light burning. That matters more than you know. Safe travels, Thomas said. Whatever you're running from or toward, I hope you find what you need. The visitor smiled. I think maybe I just did. He left. Thomas watched from the window as a car pulled away, headlights cutting through the pre-dawn grey. Then the car was gone, and Thomas was alone again. He climbed the tower one last time, watched the sun rise over the ocean, watched the beam, still sweeping faithfully even though dawn had made it invisible. At 8 o'clock, Coast Guard personnel would arrive to officially decommission the light. But for now, for these last few minutes, it was still his, still burning, still faithful. Thomas thought about the visitor, about the conversation they'd shared, about how sometimes strangers could say things friends couldn't, how one night could matter in ways you'd never expect. He didn't know the man's name, didn't know where he'd come from or where he was going. Just knew that on his last night, when he'd most needed company, someone had appeared. That felt like grace. Thomas retired to a small apartment in town, filled his days with routine, coffee, newspapers, walks along the shore. He'd see the lighthouse sometimes, dark now, just a landmark for tourists taking photos. It hurt less than he'd expected. Or maybe he was just too tired to hurt much about anything anymore. He told the story sometimes, about his last night, about the stranger who'd appeared in the storm, about the conversation that had made his final shift something more than just an ending. People listened politely, asked if he'd ever found out who the man was. Thomas always said no, said it didn't matter, said some meetings were meant to be anonymous, meant to exist as pure moments, without the weight of names and histories. He believed that. Mostly. But sometimes, late at night, he'd wonder. There'd been something familiar about the man's voice, his way of speaking, the weariness he carried. Thomas would try to place it, but memory was slippery, and 40 years of solitude had made him bad at recognizing people anyway. Then, one afternoon, 12 years after that last night, the local radio station called. They were doing a program about the lighthouse, about its history, about the keepers who'd served there. Would Thomas be willing to be interviewed? He said yes. The interview was in the station's small studio. Thomas sat across from the host, a young woman who'd been born the year he retired. She asked gentle questions about the lighthouse, about life there, about what it meant to watch over ships for 40 years. Thomas told his stories, the storms, the saves, the quiet nights watching stars wheel overhead while the beam swept faithfully below. "And your last night," the host said. "I heard there was something special about it." Thomas smiled. "There was a visitor, middle of a storm, stranger traveling through. We talked all night, about light and loneliness and what it means to watch over people you'll never meet. He understood something about that, about being needed, about carrying weight. Did you ever learn who he was?" "No, and I'm not sure it matters. He was someone who needed shelter that night. I gave it. He gave me company when I needed it. That's enough." The host nodded. "That's beautiful. You know, you talk about light and guiding people. It reminds me of something Elvis Presley once said in an interview, about how performing was like being a lighthouse, trying to reach people in darkness." She smiled. "Let me find that clip." She worked her controls. Thomas heard static. Then a voice. A man speaking, tired but warm, southern accent. "I think about it like I'm in one place, and people are out there in the dark. And maybe what I do, the music, maybe it's like a light, not saving anyone, just letting them know they're not alone, that someone's watching, someone cares." Thomas's hands gripped the armrests. That voice. He knew that voice. "Amazing similarity, right?" the host said. "The lighthouse metaphor. Must be something universal about light and connection." She was still talking, but Thomas couldn't hear her. That voice, the same rhythm, the same way of pausing, the same weariness underneath. 12 years collapsed. He was back in the lighthouse, storm raging, stranger sitting across from him, talking about performing, about being needed, about the weight of sending light into darkness. "I perform. Music, mostly. Oh, God. Elvis Presley. The stranger had been Elvis Presley, and Thomas had offered him coffee in a chipped mug and talked about ships and never realized who was sitting across from him. "Mr. Garrett?" The host's voice broke through. "Are you all right?" Thomas blinked. "Yes. Sorry. Just..." That voice. It reminded me of something. "Of your visitor?" Thomas opened his mouth, closed it. Thought about that night. About how the stranger had needed anonymity. Had needed to be just a man in a storm, not Elvis Presley. Had needed someone to talk to who didn't want anything from him, except conversation. "No," Thomas said slowly. "No. My visitor was just a traveler. Young man passing through. But the similarity is interesting." He didn't say more, didn't speculate, didn't claim. Because even if he was right, especially if he was right, the gift of that night had been the anonymity. Had been two lonely men talking without the weight of fame or expectation. Just two people trying to understand what it meant to keep light burning when you were tired. If that stranger had been Elvis Presley, he'd come to the lighthouse because he needed to be just a man, needed someone to see him as human, not as icon. And Thomas had given him that, given him shelter and coffee and conversation without recognition. That was the gift. Recognition now would diminish it. Thomas died at 83, peacefully, in his small apartment overlooking the ocean. The lighthouse was visible from his window, dark, silent, converted to a museum like he'd feared. Among his belongings, his niece found journals. 40 years of entries documenting every night at the lighthouse. Weather, ships guided, thoughts recorded in careful handwriting. And on the last page, dated the night before the light went dark, this entry: "A visitor tonight. Won't write his name. Not sure I have the right one anyway." But he understood. About light, about loneliness, about being needed and not knowing if what you do matters. We talked until dawn. Best conversation I've had in years, maybe in my life. He said something I'll remember. "We do what we're built to do. You keep light. I make music. We both try to guide people through darkness." I think he needed to know his light still mattered. I hope I gave him that. He gave me something too, proof that 40 years of watching wasn't wasted, that someone understood. The light goes dark tomorrow, but tonight, for a few hours, it meant something to someone other than ships. It meant shelter, warmth, company. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's everything. The niece donated the journals to the Lighthouse Museum. They're on display now, behind glass, pages open to that final entry. Visitors read it. Wonder about the anonymous visitor. Some claim to know. Most don't care. But sometimes, late at night when the museum is closed and moonlight falls through windows, the old lighthouse almost seems to glow. Not with electric light, that died years ago, but with something else. Memory, maybe, or meaning. The light that watched over ships for 93 years. The light that gave shelter to a stranger on a stormy night. The light that proved loneliness could be eased by a few hours of honest conversation between two men who understood what it meant to keep burning when everything said stop. That light never really dies. It just changes frequency, becomes memory instead of beam, becomes story instead of warning, becomes proof that some meetings, brief, anonymous, unrepeatable, can matter more than decades of knowing someone's name. The lighthouse stands dark on its rocky point, but the light it sent into storms, across years, through one night of grace. That light still reaches, still guides, still remembers. And somewhere in the space between waves and stars and memory, two lights met once, recognized each other, burned together for a few hours against darkness, then parted, as lights do, knowing that for one night neither was alone. And that was enough. That was everything. That was light.